One, two.
Hi guys. We're talking this week about reckoning with colonialism. Years ago, while we were raising 5 kids in the small bungalow, my wife and I had an occasion to invite a young single guy to stay with us for a few weeks. He was kind of extended family, a cousin of a cousin. And he was nice enough, even if an odd sort of fellow. Well, he sort of moved in. You might say he squatted. And weeks turned into months. And the longer he stayed, the more it became his house and we were the guests. Well, no, scratch that. We were the servants. Our kids were an inconvenience, and when he was in front of the TV, it became his domain, and he began making demands of my wife. He had dietary needs. He liked his food a certain way. And after some time, his room began to emit a foul odor. Something we couldn't quite put our finger on, but it seemed related to his laundry. Anyway, it was a stench we couldn't live with long after, or we had to live with long after he moved. Oh yeah, and he did eventually move out. And no, it wasn't an altogether happy farewell. Today, we want to engage with colonialism. And no matter how you slice it or dice it, it's left a stench everywhere it's gone. As one of our articles quotes Canadian scholar Joseph McQuaid, it takes a highly selective misreading of the evidence to claim that colonialism was anything other than a humanitarian disaster for most of the colonized. Now that seems a simple enough matter, doesn't it? I mean, I can't imagine why we'd need to bother to discuss this any further. But like everything else in life, there's so many layers. So beginning with an unequivocal yes, colonialism brought about much human suffering and subjugation. Is there any more to say about it? Well, for us in a course on global ministry, there must be more to say about it. I mean, after all, Christianity is almost inextricably related to the colonial impulse, and certainly in the contemporary discourse receives significant criticism in this regard. So any talk of post-colonial global ministry will have to be decolonized, a complex intercultural process that will involve much of the theological and practical insight this course, I hope, has inspired for you. Colonialism is a complicated issue, and I'm going to risk telling you about one of my most intimate exposures to it with a close brother I will call Bobby. I will change some of the details of the story, but not the salient matters for our conversation. Bobby came to a church that I pastored, and I met him at a prayer meeting. We became fast friends. He was an engineer who had a mid-level position in a big company in Toronto. His wife was a professional, and his kids were just at that awkward tweener stage. They had only recently come to Canada. As our relationship deepened, you ever notice how you can't have a real prayer relationship with somebody without that happening? We began sharing intimate details of our lives. It seems that Bobby had been a vice president in a large corporation in his country. His wife had owned a number of boutiques, but ruffian violence had forced him to bring his family to Canada, where he went from career hero to career zero. Still though, through hard work, he had done well over a few years. And he told me how colonialism had ravaged his country. The rape of resources, the meager recompense, often through loans. The colonizers had divided and conquered by leaving competing tribes at each other's throats for political power. But he admitted that there was an upside too. There was government infrastructure, there were courts, there was the rudiments of a health system, and he had the benefit of a British education. He was one of the lucky ones. He'd want to correct that. He'd want me to tell you he was one of the blessed ones. But how does that account for the aggregate pain and legacy of colonialism along with its perceived benefits? What does Bobby do with his conflicted feelings, his sense of displacement, and the resultant loss that he suffers now as an immigrant in another Commonwealth country? It's complicated. And it's complicated for the church too. Far too often, the church was a tool of cultural oppression and social control. Wari Boko, in one of our articles, cites how the Belgian Minister of Colonies instructed missionaries. Among other things, you will see to it to make our savages lose interest in the material wealth that their soil and subsoil are brimming with, in order to avoid that being interested in, they bloody not compete with us and dream of evicting us someday. Your knowledge of the scriptures easily will help you find passages which recommend and get people to love poverty. For instance, passages like, "Blessed are the poor, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them." And it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. You will do everything so that my blacks may be afraid of becoming rich in order to deserve heaven. So some of the papers we consider this week detail these kinds of abuses. Difficult for Christians to read, I know, but so necessary to come to terms with. John, for instance, in a paper entitled "Sleeping with the Enemy," demonstrates the unintended consequences of colonial policies that have resulted now in long-term tensions between Christian and Muslim populations in Nigeria. While I've chosen to focus mainly on Africa, Brian Stanley's paper on church-state relations in the colonial era generally reveals a checkered past on behalf of both who at times operated in separate spheres and at others vied with one another for domination. The competition between state and church found a harmony, though, at the end of the 19th century and a positive cooperation after the First World War. But there are other layers to the story. Bruce Gilley published an article in 2017 that created an academic meltdown. It was called "The Case for Colonialism," and it generated 2 separate petitions signed by thousands of academics demanding that it be retracted, and 15 of 34 of the journal's editorial board resigned in protest. That paper examines what it considers some of the positive contributions of colonialism that its abusive past obscures. Some considered the treatment racist, and others saw it as a fresh look at a potential solution to the impasse of successful development in these countries. I add in the notes a couple of critiques of the paper for you to consider. An even more interesting layer to the story, though, is uncovered in Christianity Today, in an article that introduces the work of Robert Woodbury. The scholar It's live and in person. The scholar discovered through meticulous work, empirical evidence for things that have often been said about the positive contribution of the missionary enterprise. He shows how education and health, culture were positively impacted, and demonstrates how liberal democracy was clearly supported by missionary agencies, often in defiance and opposition of colonial systems. Areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are on average more economically developed today, with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental associations. Protestant missionaries not funded by the state, were regularly very critical of colonialism. Well, finally, I offer a few articles to decolonize our minds. Fuller Seminary missiologist Shaw, I think was his name, claims we as Christians have been colonized by Western paradigms, and we need to free ourselves of that colonialism and Western provincialism in order to truly know the Creator God that we long to communicate. And Malawian missiologist Harvey Kwiyami notes or points out the possibilities for decolonizing mission in the wake of the George Floyd debacle. But he says the situation is dire and really unrecognized by white hegemonies. The very fact, he says, that black and brown people form less than 5% of theology and missiology lecturers in the UK is symptomatic of the problem. Black and brown people form 14% of the population of the UK, and yet they comprise a significantly large percentage of theology and missiology students across the country. It should be possible to teach mission. It should not be possible to teach mission in any of our cities with an all-white team, and yet this is common. And generally speaking, most theology and missiology syllabi across the UK will have no less than 100% white authored books for students to read. Our church planting courses seem to ignore the fact that African movements are planting the most churches and are growing their churches the fastest. And possibly they know a thing or two to teach. So the problem about colonialism, well, the problem is getting my cousin's cousin Greg out of the basement. I'm sure he brought us some good gifts, but it's hard to appreciate them after that unpleasant odor he leaves behind. And we never may be rid of that. And there it is, the challenge of colonialism. Talk to you again next week.